to work it as a funnel. We're going to take the big issues first. We're going to take some big, broad issues. How are we doing? We'll go to that question. Get your apps out. Get your phones working so we can ask those questions. We're going to ask our panelists. We have a terrific panel here, mix of official sector and the market perspective. So we'll get we'll have a good interaction, active discussion to ask and answer whether we've achieved our goal or not. So to my right, we have Michael Davie, Global Head of Rates with LCH. To his right, Mike Gill, Chief of Staff to Commissioner Chris Giancarlo at the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. We're all in line. Yep. Next to him, Mr. Kazunari Mochizuki-san, Director of International Financial Markets and Settlements at the JFSA. To his right, somebody who you may or may not know, who's never shows up at many panels, but and nor does she have very many strong views. But we've included Dr. Kay Swinburne, member of European Parliament, on the panel just as well, just to see if she can come up with some views here. And she serves in a very important role as the Vice Chair of the Economics and Monetary Affairs Committee at the European Parliament. To her right is Petr Wagner, Vice Counselor of the Delegation of the European Union to the United States. So he just down the street from the CFTC, I believe, in the old offices still? Good. So that, no doubt that conversation is ongoing. And then at the end, Clare Woodman, Chief Operating Officer of Institutional Securities, Morgan Stanley. So we do have a strong official sector representation here, but we do have some good market perspective with some strong views about this. So let's go to this first question, and there we are. And I'm going to ask a similar question to our panelists, but this will help make sure that we understand where 800 of our members come out on this. But it should be known that way back in the CFTC launched its first extraterritorial rulemaking, and this was a rulemaking that said that any U.S. persons, and I'm paraphrasing and summarizing it, of course, has to apply U.S. rules anywhere they trade. So U.S. flagged persons or U.S. entities would really have to apply U.S. rules. As a commissioner, I traveled overseas and I got some pretty considerable pushback on that notion. It said, wait a minute, we're going to come up with very similar rules as well. Why don't you respect those and recognize those going forward? So I think maybe that had something to do with kind of the current state of being, and I should point out that it was not the current chairman in office, it was a different chairman. With that view. So
who was commissioner at that time?
Who was commissioner? There were a few commissioners. Some in this room. But so we want to ask a question. So let's see how you interpret the effectiveness of regulators. Ooh. So when I asked the question of our official sector to Petr and Kay and Michael, your view on this, given that where'd it go? Given that our audience is somewhat skeptical of the effectiveness of this harmonization effort, from your perspective, and I'll start with Mike, and we'll just kind of work our way down. How successful do you think regulators have been? And then where do you go from here is a big question.
So, first of all, the caveat, I'm speaking on my own behalf and not on behalf of the CFTC. But I will paraphrase Chairman Giancarlo's remarks on that cross-border guidance that was put out by the CFTC and the extraterritoriality of our rule set 4 years ago. He's sort of done a mea culpa on behalf of the agency to our European friends and our Japanese friends and the other regulators around the world that it was too broad, and a more holistic view that defers to local jurisdictions for those types of issues that are not related to systemic risk is probably a better path forward. And so, you know, I'm by nature an optimist. I noticed that ISDA put out this morning a very handy guide on how to navigate the MTF, CEF, OTF relationship. And I can say that some of the issues that were identified in here as you know, still requiring extra steps that shouldn't be in terms of external business conduct standards. The CFTC will be putting forth no action relief on external business conduct standards for those that operate on MTFs and OTFs probably within the next 2 weeks. We're also going to, and as a part of that no action relief, there will be a discussion on, we're going to eventually amend the rule set so that we won't have to keep extending the no action relief. One of the other issues that was mentioned was the counting of, for non-US participants who trade anonymously on an MTF, OTF, they will not have to count those trades as part of their de minimis calculation. And so, you know, as the ISDA, very well done, ISDA briefing puts out, a lot has been done in terms of, at least with the EU and the US in the trade platforms over the last couple of years. We've gotten some accomplishments in. Obviously, my reading of this, the reporting is still very burdensome, and you know, it's something that with time I think can be addressed. I'll stay optimistic before I get to the data protection initiative that's going on in Europe, which will probably affect reporting. But I do believe that we're on the right track. We recognize at the CFTC that it was many of our own rule sets that were applied overseas that have caused some of the problem. And I think there's a recognition at the agency to look at those issues and provide more deference in terms of our rule sets to local jurisdictions. I would also mention, in terms of regulator to regulator contacts, you know, we have a very good staff to staff relationship with ESMA. We've been working with them on some information sharing with our CPs, where they're working directly with us. That had been a problem in the past, and I think we've hit a new phase in that relationship on data sharing. We've also had a number of very productive meetings between the CFTC, the Federal Reserve, the FDIC, and the Bank of England on understanding clearinghouse risk and who does what in various situations. I won't say we've solved the problem, but we've made tremendous progress in the last couple of months in sort of identifying who's responsible and what would we do in certain scenarios. And I think that's really an example of the way that these international regulator relations should work. The CFTC's relationship with the Bank of England's always been strong, but in many ways it's a handshake deal. Not a lot of our relationship with the Bank of England is written down and prescriptive. It's a very, we work with them. There's not a lot of grabbing for territory on either side. There's not a lot of suspicion on either side. It's a very collaborative relationship. And I know later on we'll talk about some of the third-party potential complications from Brexit. Well, that's one of the things that I personally am worried about. I would hate to see that relationship suffer because of the need to sort of be more prescriptive about how it works. So let me stop there. And in general, I'm always an optimist. I know that from the survey and from conversations that I have in the hallways, people feel that the fragmentation and the lack of harmonization on the global rules could be better. I hear you. But at the same time, I think there has been tremendous progress, and I have yet to see in any of these international discussions with the other regulators someone say, we're going to do it our way regardless of what's right or wrong just because we're stubborn. I mean, there's always there is a rationale to why different jurisdictions choose different avenues. We're all learning in the swaps process over the last couple of years, and so I do think over time the reporting aspect to this will get better. Not perfect, but better.
Terrific. I should point out, and I'm glad you did, thank you very much, ISDA did put out a paper today on supporting cross-border equivalence. We have a couple of charts from that we'll put up on the screen in a minute as we kind of break down the discussion by, and we get a little more narrow on the trade execution front, we'll put up some of the good charts that we've developed out of that. And then last fall, ISDA put out a paper on kind of a risk-based approach to cross-border harmonization, which if you have not read it, you should. Makes it a lot easier to have this discussion. Mochizuki-san, maybe Japan has been a strong partner in the G20 from the very beginning, has implemented rules, clearing requirements, trading requirements, et cetera. You've engaged in all of the international negotiations up till now. How do you see what is your perspective on the harmonization of rules, and what is your outlook?
First of all, thank you very much for inviting me to this conference. I'm glad to be here, my remarks is my personal views, and this is not represent my the organization's official views. So please note that. As Scott pointed out, several years have passed since the financial crisis, and a series of regulatory reforms have been established and implemented by the G20s and the FSB jurisdictions for safer and more resilient financial systems. Japan FSA has advocated that the global regulatory reform efforts should aim to attain both growth and stability. Japan FSA also ensure that the remaining elements of the post-crisis reforms be finalized in line with this principle and contribute to the global effort to evaluate the impact of reforms. If we look at the international fora, I think we emphasize that in general, the stage has been moved from the rule-making processes to evaluation of the reforms. This is the current trend of the discussion at the international fora right now, but please let me pick up one of the examples of the implementation of the international standards. Margin requirements for non-centrally cleared derivatives based on the G20 agreement and came into force on the September 1st, 2016. The margin requirements, however, were implemented as agreed internationally by only three jurisdictions. The gap in the implementation timing posed significant challenges for jurisdictions abiding by the internationally agreed schedule because counterparties, particularly those located in the jurisdiction of delayed implementation, often seek to avoid incurring the costs associated with them. I would like to stress the importance of each jurisdiction's commitment to the internationally agreed timeline, and bearing in mind that the difference in the implementation timing across the jurisdictions could raise certain operation and competitive challenges for industry. In order to fill the gap in the scope and the details of certain regulation, relevant authorities play an important role to coordinate supervisory approaches for addressing difficulties involved in the cross-border transactions. And this issue could be addressed through a difference when it is justified, in line with the St. Petersburg G20 leaders' declaration, which still remains important to achieve the intended objectives of the reforms. Japan has already issued equivalence determinations for 5 jurisdictions for margin requirements, and which include the CFTC, Canadian OSFI, Australian APRA, Singapore MAS, and Hong Kong HKMA. And we will continue to further cooperation with the relevant authorities toward the initial margin big bang in 2020. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Kay, your perspective on where we stand today and what your hopes are for the future.
So I stand in a fairly unusual position as a British politician in the European Parliament. So my life has changed rather since a certain vote that happened in the UK a couple of years ago. But it does mean that I have a fairly unusual perspective because my day job is still doing legislation in the European Parliament, whereas I also play a liaising role with the UK government and the future relationship going forwards post-Brexit. So it's an unusual couple of hats I'm wearing right now. But the reality being that the 7 years before the referendum, I had spent working on financial regulation, and I'm actually very proud of the fact that we have achieved a large amount of convergence in the global regulatory framework. We, for the first time in the Parliament that started in 2009, post-financial crisis, we stand for 5-year terms, and that entire 5-year term, we had global perspective in mind when we wrote every piece of legislation. It may not have felt like it from other jurisdictions, but we certainly used the G20 as being the baseline, and any of the work that was coming out of the global fora as being where we started from and where we came back to anchor European legislation. And within that European legislation, we built in review periods. So the European markets in financial regulation and market infrastructure, the review period was 3 years after implementation, which is why we're now reviewing that piece of legislation. But we never expected to get everything right the first time. We always expected to have to come back and make corrections for this new groundbreaking pieces of regulation. So we're in the middle of that process of review right now. Sadly, what should have been a nice, smooth transition in terms of maybe tweaking a few things that weren't correct has now got wound up into a much bigger discussion on what the future relationship is going to be with the UK outside of the EU. And so those reviews should have been simple and now turning into a major political discussions rather than actually just how do we get consistency across the world. So life is a little more complicated. And I think we've gone from having the global perspective at the forefront of our minds to now having a much more of a what is the future of the EU 27 with the UK financial services sector outside of it. So if you take a global financial centre, the size of London, and remove it from the heart of the EU, and you now have a third country relationship, what does that do to the rest of the EU 27's financial services markets? And so we've got a very different set of discussions going on at the moment. Much of it is in primary legislation, which is preempting the bigger Brexit discussions on financial services. But I think there are all sorts of connotations and complications that we have to be aware that actually the global system benefits from this enhanced cooperation that has been set up amongst the global regulators in particular. That daily dialogue between regulators didn't happen before. It happened bilaterally, it didn't happen on this multilateral basis before. We cannot lose sight of that gain. We have to make sure that global regulation continues. And no matter how difficult and fraught the UK-EU relationship happens to be over the next 1 year, possibly even through transition of the next 3 years in total, we have to bear in mind that global cooperation is a much bigger goal, that it's in everyone's interest to keep at the center of what we're doing.
Petr, that offers you a great opportunity to talk about that unified spirit and where, I mean, I think Kay's absolutely correct that you're at a transition point. It was a bilateral relationship. Now we're talking about a more holistic EU 27 question. How do you reflect on that? And let's just set aside kind of the success or failure of what we've achieved today. I mean, what do we do going forward here?
Thank you for that. I think I will echo a lot what was said here in terms of the certain optimism of where we can go with foreign regulators and also how much, particularly in the EU, we have looked at the G20 standards in our legislation. I mean, what we need to understand is that this is an evolving sector, and there was a bonanza of regulation, obviously post-crisis, for good reasons, but there was a lot of it. And it's constantly evolving, and it's absolutely important that all the regulators speak, both on the international global fora, and I would also add to that, among major jurisdictions, we need enhance stronger regulatory cooperation. And I think with the United States, and particularly, we made a huge progress on that. The regulatory forum we have, or the way we speak among the different regulators, I think in the last years it has improved. Now, so what we have in the EU to mitigate certain frictions that may happen if independent jurisdictions regulate, we have a system of equivalence. And at the risk of something obnoxious, we are quite proud of it. We have over 200 decisions with 30 jurisdictions. Now, is it all perfect? Does it cover all area? It does not. Is there room for improvement? Yes. But our equivalence system is working where it can work. It is, and there is one thing I wanted to stress in particular, it is always outcomes-based equivalence, and it is always going to be outcomes-based equivalence. Within the single market, within the EU, we go further, we go stronger. So the laws must be completely aligned. We go by line. So if there is a European law in the form of a directive, the transposition is being checked very thoroughly. In discussions with third jurisdictions, we always going to go for outcomes-based equivalence, and the other mood in Brussels, at least from my masters, is that we would like to see more, not less, deference with foreign partners like the United States. Now, you have jumped to going forward. I assume you mean us and the UK, right? So you know that the discussions are ongoing. There is a very clear process that has been split in certain phases. We've had some milestones in agreeing on the sort of substance of the transition. That is, of course, not a done deal yet, in a sense that it's contingent of agreeing on the entire withdrawal agreement. So quite unfortunately for the companies, the legal certainty will only come with ratification. But at least I think the takeaway from here would be that both parties, the UK and the European Union, negotiate in good faith, and they try to adhere to the deadlines that have been set, right? It is always very difficult to speculate, and especially for a European bureaucrat like me, is to speculate about future, which consists of an international negotiation. I mean, it's difficult to provide running commentary on negotiations. It's difficult also to provide a certain degree of transparency of these negotiations. But I can say that at this moment, with the last, based on the last agreement on the parts of the withdrawal deal and withdrawal agreement and the transition, we are now able to pre-scope at least what the trading relation across all domains with the United Kingdom will be. We are not there yet, and I think I can really not outline you where we're going to land in terms of the relationship right now.
Can I ask you, Kay brought up a good point that the EU is kind of thinking about how its relationship, in particular third-party, changes and what its role. Do you think that delays any conversations with the U.S. on equivalence decisions as a result of Brexit, or can you have those conversations with the U.S. and with Japan and other jurisdictions while you're dealing with Brexit, making headway on MiFID II or EMIR issues, right? Data clearing.
No, I mean, we do continue having these conversations, that's for sure. And you've seen that we did with CFTC a deal in October, so this is all continues. Now, of course, besides these discussions, we have some staff who works also on Brexit, yeah, and takes their time and skills.
Okay, let's bring in, you get the... Oh, okay.
Final word.
Just final word.
Yeah,
that would not probably be appropriate. Just to say that on equivalence, the EU, however, adds a slight complication to this. The Parliament has just written an own initiative report on redefining what the equivalence process is. And indeed, we're expecting a legislative proposal on actually a new equivalence regime to come forwards from the Commission very shortly, certainly within this mandate. So we may know what equivalence is today. It's a political decision taken by the Commission with a 30-day withdrawal notice period. In future, we don't know what it's going to be. And what we do know is that they say the current equivalence process cannot be used by systemically important third countries, i.e. the UK. So we know that there is going to be a different relationship between the UK and the EU going forwards. It's a question of, within a free trade deal, how that gets structured, and indeed whether or not we end up with a financial services chapter specifically within a free trade deal, which takes you to a different process other than the routine equivalence. And certainly Olivier Gersson keeps going on the record saying the UK cannot use the equivalence system as it stands because it's too systemically important to the EU. So we have to have a bespoke arrangement going forwards. It's a question of how that affects everybody else's equivalence decisions in the round as well.
Well, let's come back to that question because yes, the EU or the EC has a perspective. I understand Parliament has a report it's issued, and ESMA's shared its views on a broader set. So we'll come back to the Brexit question. Let's go to Clare. And as the COO of a globally active bank, you live and breathe this on a regular basis, how you navigate fractured markets or at least closely aligned markets, but not identical markets. So you have compliance requirements in both jurisdictions, in multiple jurisdictions. What is your thought on this?
Yeah, Scott, sorry, because originally you'd asked me, so what's our, wish list in terms of harmonisation? And I think you clearly laid out just why harmonisation and harmonised rules are really important, and everyone benefits from that. Market participants, regulators, the system. I actually think, despite the quick survey that you did, the pulse in the room, I think the progress at the back end of last year was remarkable, actually. And Mike's right, it was another example of when regulators can really trust each other to do their own jobs in their own markets, everyone can benefit from that. Wish list. So beyond G20, and Kay kind of laid this up for me, actually. Top of, I think, everyone's wish list has to be at the moment that Brexit, we get some form of mutual recognition between the UK and the EU. I think Kay's absolutely right. I think trying to have financial services workable under equivalence regimes would be incredibly difficult. And I think actually probably the response to your question just highlights everyone's understanding that the equivalence process takes time and effort and a real commitment on both sides. And that for financial services as a whole, beyond derivatives markets, is going to be very, very difficult, I think, to navigate. So Brexit's got to be top of the list. And sorry, Scott, I thought I would be front-running some of the other topics we're going to discuss, but my panelists were well ahead of me on that one. Obviously, for any financial institution operating in derivatives markets, the whole trade and regulatory reporting space is something we just all want continued focus on, and we need some simplification there and some real focus. I think some of the guidance that's just recently come out on reporting in OTC markets, I think from CPMI and IOSCO, should helpfully give regulators a roadmap. So that's a useful initiative. And obviously, we all need to really focus on improving data quality because that's just key to all of the reporting initiatives. But I think, in terms of wish list, Brexit, trade reporting, data quality are key. But the paper you put out today was extremely helpful in listing ISDA's, priority areas.
Michael, from the clearinghouse perspective, things were going along pretty well. PFMIs were in place. We were all voting and had great alignment. And this was, I think, an important area to have consistency in the clearing standards, in the regulation and oversight of clearinghouses. Lately, it's become a little more fractured. What is your perspective on this? What is the outcome you'd like to see on all of this?
Yeah, so the world seems to be changing, but maybe I could just answer the question that you asked before. I think I'd give us a slightly more optimistic. I'd be a B+ or maybe an A-, because I think if you think of what we've achieved in the last however long you like, 7, 8, even 10 years, both on the trading side, volumes of trades that are going through. You pick your acronym, CEF, MTF, OTF. That's going up. They all seem to be working, as far as we can tell. On the reporting side, data quality, yes, clearly could be better, but legions more reporting than there ever was before. A lot more transparency, I think, than before. And certainly in our own work, clearing, our business has been transformed in the last few years. The products, the services that we used to operate 7 or 10 years ago, we don't even have in the clearinghouse anymore. They've gone to other CCPs, they've gone to other providers, and yet the services that we do that are large now in the clearinghouse are the more global services, foreign exchange, and obviously the service that I'm heading up, the swaps service, the global swap service. So I think I'd give us a B+ or A-. Having said that, perhaps it's worth just digressing for a minute on our business model, because we don't really rely on substituted compliance or equivalence to a great degree. For better or worse, we've always plowed ahead to get directly regulated or directly registered in most, if not all, of the jurisdictions in which we meaningfully operate. And as we've grown the service across now 18 currencies, we've attracted at least 17 regulatory regimes that we answer to, and trying to keep harmony between those and trying to solve for probably the highest standard amongst them sometimes can be a challenge. But it feels that in terms of providing certainty to all our users, certainty to the regulators in whose jurisdictions we're operating, that just feels like a better prescription, really. And particularly if you're running a systemically important service. I think that having said that, whilst we certainly promote direct registration, and I'm sure we'll talk some more about this when we talk about Brexit and the location policy, so-called, we'd argue strongly that it should be proportionate. It needs to be thoughtful. Not all CCPs are the same. In fact, very few CCPs are the same. And in fact, the services within the CCPs differ. So we operate in many jurisdictions under the CFTC, also in Canada, in Switzerland, in Australia and Hong Kong, under a regime where the legal entity is obviously regulated, but it's really the service that's overseen and controlled. And we think that that's a very important piece. That's a sort of proportionate oversight, proportionate regulation. So really that's the way we go. So I think we've done pretty well, but not necessarily always through substituted compliance and equivalence.
Any further thoughts on that question? And then we'll take it down a bit more granular. We'll go to the Brexit question. I think Kay raised a very good point that we have new proposals by the European Commission. March 23rd, the Commission published its new Phase 2 negotiating guidelines for financial services. That made some good progress and helped scope where the discussion was going to focus. It talked about outcomes-based approach, but I think it may kind of feel like a more line-by-line approach from maybe an industry perspective. There was also a parliamentary report. Brian Hayes, MEP, had an initial draft that circulated that talks about a third-party recognition regime, kind of focused a little bit more on mutual recognition. I think, broadly speaking, the industry would favor something more like that. It was very positive on trying to get the right outcomes and less focus on trying to do this equivalence analysis. And then finally, ESMA's made its views known that under its authority under EMIR and MIFIR, in its part of the debate, it would like to establish kind of a single approach, European approach, instead of relying on the national competent authorities. This sounds more efficient, but maybe the competent authorities might have a different view on this. Petr, maybe I can ask you, if there are these, at a minimum, there are 3 things that are kind of proposals floating around. How do we think about this? How should the audience think about this? How does it play out between the Commission, the Parliament, and ESMA?
So when I was coming here, I was like, oh, that's great. These Brexit discussions show highly political. If there is one way how I would describe Brexit, I think, and I think it's important for the audience to understand it, is Brexit means change. It is necessarily a change. At this moment, there is one single rule book, there is a Court of Justice, there is supervisors, European supervisors, and we are going through a change. Now we need to approach this positively. Nobody wants cliff edges, nobody wants disruption, fragmentation, but we need to be realistic what you can also achieve. What happened is recently is that the Council, how that works in Europe. European Commission is the body that proposes legislation, but the legislator is obviously the European Parliament and the Council. Equally for international negotiations, what we do is to follow guidelines that are given to us by the Council, where the member states sit. And it has been felt that the way forward for discussions with the UK would be a trade agreement, which is supposed to be wide-ranging, but it's a free trade agreement. For that reason, that the red line of the UK for negotiation is to leave the single market and customs union. Now, and then I don't want to speculate what can be in a trade agreement in a situation where we are launching the scoping exercise, what could be possibly in it. I really cannot do that. But what is always good to look what has been done in the past and what's there. In free trade agreements, there are provisions of financial services market access. There is also among developed jurisdictions like the United States and then EU and then obviously then UK. There is a GATS understanding which goes a bit further of what some other jurisdictions provide in financial services. But in a situation where you no longer have one single court of justice as a warrant of the rules, people tend to place in trade agreements something called prudential carve-out. And I'm not. Again, I don't want to speculate, but I would imagine that that's how the jurisdiction will continue doing things. I think the key, the equivalence in this respect that has worked for us. I mean, we are reviewing it. We're trying to have more risk-sensitive approach to it according to the exposure of that particular jurisdiction to us. It's true that equivalence will always be a unilateral decision that can be withdrawn. I understand that. I just wonder, for me, I always wondered why this potential withdrawal within 30 days provokes such scare, because I would assume that comes only in a situation when one of these jurisdictions, which benefits from the equivalence agreement, is actually moved away in its regulation. Presumably that happens through a process. That happens to a process in the United States, notice and comment. So it doesn't just happen that from day one somebody changes and in 30 days you withdraw. There would be process which you would know and we would be discussing it. So yeah, I think that our view on that is that we want to use equivalence and deference for the way forward, but again, it's just too early to speculate where we're going to land in a negotiation which has not really started.
We've put up a new question. Will the UK and EU be able to, firms be able to seamlessly transact derivatives across borders post-Brexit? I hope you have been thinking about this. And before I throw it over to Kay, let's take a look at the results. Yeah, there's some optimism, just about as much pessimism. Well, let's let that digest. Kay, maybe you can help. From the parliamentary perspective, this draft report, what's its role in the discussion and the debate, and how do you see what is your preference, and how do you see this turning out?
So, unlike Petr, I don't actually think the equivalence system that we currently have in the EU works, and nor do my colleagues in the European Parliament. Hence why we have organised for our own initiative report to be drafted, and Brian Hayes has done his first draft and has put it out there for amendment process through the whole of the committee. We collectively, as coordinators, and I'm one of 6 of them in the Parliament, decided that the process isn't a process. There is a strange system whereby the Commission makes a decision with no timelines, no expectations, and no third country knows what stage their application is at. And we decided that that wasn't appropriate for an entity as large as the EU, that it should have a system by which it goes through a very fair, open, transparent process by which you apply, you know how long it's going to take, you know at which stage there are some issues, you get notified of what those issues are. When you get equivalence and somebody decides you're actually diverting from the agreed equivalence regime, that you then get notified as to what you're in breach of or what you might be about to breach, in order for you to be able to make a correction, rather than lose your equivalence on a political decision with 30 days notice. So I don't think the Parliament's requests at this point in Brian's report are unreasonable for a mature region like the EU to have a process that the Commission has to be held accountable to. And indeed, you can and have to have a process of withdrawing it. But it needs to be a process, and it needs to be an acknowledgement that if you are in breach, you have a chance to remedy it before you then actually go through a process of being notified that that will be withdrawn. So in general, this is an own initiative report. It has no legal bearing, but it has political weight. And very few own initiative reports that come out of the Parliament with significant political cross-party support don't at least find their way into a draft proposal by the Commission. And it does influence the political setting in which the Commission will put forward its proposals. We're expecting those proposals very shortly. So I would expect those before the summer. And I think the Commission itself, certainly under the former Commissioner, Lord Hill, had already said he believed the equivalence process, having gone through the CCP equivalence with the US, was not sufficient, that it needed to be more robust and needed to be more accountable and transparent. So I think we're in a system whereby that acknowledgement has been made, and we now need to remedy it as soon as possible. Sadly, Brexit is clouding the issue, but it shouldn't, because I think the Brexit situation will be a very different set of discussions, as I say, because it is two sets of rules that are identical on day one. The UK and the EU have identical rules in every sector on day one. So unlike any other relationship, this is about how you prevent future divergence, as opposed to how you maintain or get to a position of convergence. So I think the UK is a unique situation, and it will be subject, I believe, to a free trade deal that will be unique in its scope, because for the first time ever globally, you have two jurisdictions who will have identical sets of rules. That has never happened before. And so it gives an opportunity to set a brand new global standard for what could be included in a free trade deal, both goods and services, and a method by which mutual recognition, not just for financial services, but for any highly technical regulated sector, could actually then apply. And all free trade deals have an arbitration system at their heart. So I think what Petr was saying, that you no longer have the ECJ, well, the European Court of Justice does have a role, as does the jurisdiction that the trade agreement is done with, but there has to be an arbitration mechanism within it. And that's common. It's in the recently agreed Canadian deal. There are definite precedents that we can use. And I think in this opportunity, we need to look at the bigger global picture of how we might set the first free trade deal that really encompasses a modern services agreement into a general free trade agreement.
Can you touch on how both the Commission and the Parliament are going to be able to resolve their differences, and maybe a perspective on timetable if they're coming at it with us?
I expect the Commission to put forward a proposal before the summer. And because of the way that the European Parliament term comes to an end in May next year, in fact, the Parliament will dissolve soon after the end of March, and when Brexit happens, it happens to coincide. So you'll have the Parliament dissolving, so we have to get everything through by the last parliamentary plenary session at the end of March 2019 in order for it to be on the statute book, in order for it to happen. Of course, the Parliament changes, but so too does the Commission. So the new Commission will come in after the new Parliament has been elected. And so you have that new commission, new set of priorities, and everybody feels that anything that's a legacy file needs to be completed, if at all possible, during that cycle. So they will try their hardest to get this through the Parliament vote by March 2019 next year, in order that it's on the statute book ready for the next commission to take forwards.
Mike, Kay laid out a pretty different view of the world from Parliament and the Commission, at least in her perspective. Where does a third country like the U.S., how do you look at this, and what are you seeking out of this?
Well, in some ways, we're obviously, it's not our role to make it more complicated. And so, I think the commissioners, the chairman have gone to great lengths to distance themselves from any sort of taking sides in Brexit. But obviously, we've already, had some forewarnings of how it may affect us in terms of the CCP equivalence that we reached a couple years ago. And that has major concerns for not just the CFTC, but the U.S. side writ large. I guess, one of the interesting aspects when Kay's talking about the optimistic viewpoint that the UK-EU relationship could be the basis of, one of the first free trade agreement that would include financial services. In some ways that could be worrying for the United States, because it would be a tremendously powerful free trade agreement that we would not have been a part of, and that template would sort of be presented to the United States, and I think that would be, maybe put us in a tough position in terms of our own negotiations with the UK on a free trade agreement, or with restarting the European talks in a free trade agreement. So it's an interesting dynamic that if the UK and the EU come to a successful resolution, could that possibly put the United States and Japan and some other entities in a difficult position, because now you've got a joint position, but two different strong financial centers kind of united, and here's the best way forward. And while I think holistically we have always been in general agreement with Europe, with Japan, with Australia on a lot of financial issues, we do have differences in how our markets evolve, and that's an important dynamic. I would be concerned if the resolution of Brexit was such that the cultural manifestation of financial services in Europe and the UK were suddenly de facto the right way to go. We use the example a lot in the equities markets. If you want to list in New York, it's a different set of rules than if you want to list in London, and nobody's particularly upset about that. People deal with it all the time. I would hate to suddenly be faced with the prospect of, if we want closer coordination with the UK, we're going to have to adopt the EU's regime. So that sort of concerns me long term. Short term, the one issue that we've had and we've made our comments on is the recognition of the CCPs that we agreed to a couple years ago. And not to beat a dead horse, but from our side, we feel that the legislation that's making its way through the EU would essentially take what was a two-way negotiation between the United States and the European Union and turn it into a one-way negotiation between the European Union and United States clearinghouses. And that in a nutshell is our concern about how this Brexit debate is going to affect the United States. and not surprisingly, Petr has a comment.
Actually, no, it's a comment to Scott. I mean, I would like to sort of play down a little bit what you said, Scott, about the differences between European Parliament and the Commission. I would like to explain how that works. So we have now a framework for equivalence that is there. Now, the European Parliament, in its own right, as elected body, has put up a report. It's not finalized. There will be one. And that's indeed a political call. Commission, this is what we think. And to that we respond a certain way. Now, of course, there are differences in legislative process. How that works, that Commission has the legislative initiative, we come up with that, and then our people like Kate and her colleagues who like it, don't like it, change it. This is how that works. So, of course, per se, in the English language, that's different. But what I kind of would like to move away from that, there's parliaments, there's the Commission, this, and where is the US in it? I mean, you're kind of making a bridge but among things that are sort of not there, because one thing is the equivalence that we may need to change and or not. Look, the equivalence has been an ongoing topic within the Commission. We have published a staff working document on that, where we've put forward some views on how it should be done in terms of proportionality, in terms of risk sensitiveness. It is a tough one. It's a tough one. I remember we were thinking of doing it indeed under Lord Hill. I was still in Brussels before I got my job here in DC. What I would say, and I hope I can say it on a panel, of course that Brexit has augmented the need, because people were talking about it, yeah, equivalence is there, we should look at it. With Brexit, people really think maybe we should, right? So people doing just that. Another issue is the trade agreement. As I say, I will not speculate what's going to be in it, what's going to be the scoping exercise until it's being launched and until we have clearance to share that. Of course, Case is free as a politician to say, this is what I would like to see, this is how it should be. So that's so much for the difference between the institutions, okay? And I'm not going to have a comment on yours.
Yeah, I've just decided we're canceling lunch. We're going to keep going here. This is getting interesting. I don't know where to go to Clare, go to Michael on the equivalence. Clare, maybe you could reflect on where do you find yourself on this Brexit question? You're kind of the ping pong ball everybody's fighting over.
Scott, I need to get to the B's and D's in the room over lunch to assure them that, come, Brexit cliff edge, they're not going to find, global firms unable to transact and do business for their clients. So the B's and D's, I'll see you later to reassure you with my fellow peers in the room. But, the reality is that all firms who have based their EU access and gateway into the EU in the UK have already looked at, their European footprint and their legal entity structures and models and know exactly what they need to do, if they need to do anything, to augment what they've got. And it's really a process of, agile iteration to make sure that when we know exactly what we're transitioning to, we just can continue to seamlessly serve clients. So honestly, B's and D's, I really don't think you need to be so pessimistic. We will get there and firms will absolutely be able to serve clients. But I think, Peter, your point about a real fear and really that's concentrated and focused on the whole withdrawal agreement focus is largely because, everyone's woken up to the fact, well, what are we transitioning to? Look, we've all got to be pleased that we've got Kay in Europe because she really gets the issues that financial services have, and at least we've got somebody there who is really thinking through the issues and anticipating this. So that's really positive.
Mochizuki-san, do you want to?
Thank you. So, this may not be directly responding to your question, but I would like to make general remarks on the equivalence determination process. I would like to put the emphasis on the 3 points. The first point is that international standards should be used as a yardstick for the equivalence assessment of equivalence determination. The second point is that equivalence process and the timeline and the scope should be transparent in advance. And the third point is that the equivalence, the difference with the third country's rules should be respected, and the assessment should be made on the basis of the outcomes-based approach. These points are very important in order to avoid the unintended consequences in the market. Thank you.
Let's go to the next question, or the next slide. had a slide in there. Let me just, this, I hope it's bigger on the big screen. Well, of course it's bigger on the big screen, but I hope it's more, you could read it on the big screen. This is an attempt, this is related to our paper, and gives you a perspective on, let's see, on the left side, the more complex side is actually the EU side, and on the right side is the US side. What we have done, the ISDA team has done here, is to map trade execution process flows from, starting with the basis of equivalence that has been granted between CEFs and MTFs, which we appreciate and was a great success. But that captures the execution itself. If you then walk through these flow charts, if you're a US person trading on an MTF, you have certain requirements in Europe, and that is reflected on the left-hand box. If you're a European person or anybody trading in the US, that's reflected on the right-hand box. Now, equivalence only exists on trade execution. The rest of this, there is no equivalence and there is no substituted compliance. So you're left with a workflow that is complex, challenging, and if you're a US person trading in Europe, you're gonna have to do both sides. And vice versa, because there is no substituted compliance in this area. Now, so there are data rules, there's pre and post trade reporting rules. There's actually no clearing equivalence, but there's few clearing houses, so that's a fairly straightforward, and those map really well. The data sets and the data reporting requirements do not map. There is no sharing of data. So maybe I will turn this question over to Clare. Maybe you can reassure your clients one more time on how they're going to deal with this and how you're going to support them in this. And then I'm going to ask maybe Mike and Kay to kind of reflect on how you solve this. And while they're speaking, you're going to vote on one more thing so we can wrap this up in 2 minutes.
You know I'm not in the sales department, don't you? But look, of course, those charts look pretty scary and really complex. But substituted compliance was absolutely the appropriate and the best solution. I think from our perspective, and actually it's a shame we don't have someone from the buy side up here with us, but I think, we're not seeing clients toggle between trade execution silos dependent on regulatory reporting or other obligations. Clients tend to like to transact in their regions and their particular markets. And so we're not really per se seeing firms optimize between one regime and another. If unfortunately we see, changes to market liquidity and the depth and the quality of market liquidity that pushes firms to have to seek liquidity outside their home markets, you may see them taking into different considerations into account when they're transacting. But so far, that's not what we're seeing.
Mike or Kay, so Kay can have the last word. Mike, you can go first. How do you want to solve this?
So I did have the benefit of reading the paper prior to coming out this morning, and as I said, the reporting aspect. So we've got differences in sort of pre-trade. We've got differences in sort of post-trade reporting, and that sort of reflects a difference in just sort of priorities of the legislature when they were putting these things together. When it comes to the post-trade reporting, I think that's something that we can focus on and get to a better place with the SDRs in the U.S. and how do we share data. It is obviously not optimal for Clare to have to report the same exact trade to an EU entity and a US registered entity. We got to resolve that. And I think with sort of better understanding of what we're looking for in terms of information, there ought to be a way for the entities to share that information directly, either with the regulator or with the US SDR, rather than this dual reporting. That being said, we have this parallel problem as governments where we're with Facebook and some other issues, we're moving in the opposite direction in terms of a comfort level of sharing data between jurisdictions. So to me, the reporting is the thing that would reduce the greatest burden if we could tackle it. And I almost think at a micro level with the financial regulators, we sort of understand what our perfect world would be. I think everyone's hesitant to say, okay, you got it, and we'll trust you, and if we need this information, you'll give it directly to us. But I do think that's where we want to get to. I mean, that trust should be there with Japanese regulators and European regulators and UK. I mean, that shouldn't be that difficult. I do think this parallel track of the larger data issue is going to be difficult in the short term.
Okay, a final word.
I think Mike is right. Data is the key point here, and the privacy of data is becoming an increasingly more difficult topic in Brussels. And we've only got to look at what's happened with Facebook and data for all the suspicions, and the politicians always felt they didn't trust others with European data. We've now seen an example of a large corporation, US-based, not being trusted with the data. So I think trust and data are going to be the key sticking points going forwards. This shouldn't have been a difficult point with regards to deference and with regards to finding a way forwards technically. But I think in the latest environment with regards to those data breaches, it's going to be much more difficult. And with GDPR having its implementation date, a couple of weeks away, this is a key point. And Europe has got a problem in sharing data between member states and with its national competent authorities. ESMA's already complaining it doesn't have sufficient data reported directly to it or accessible from member states. So it is unlikely that they will find it easy to rely upon a request and delivery of that information. I suspect Europe will, going forwards, want to have a direct reporting mechanism rather than relying upon the requests through national competent authorities or through other third country regulators. So unfortunately, what should be simple as a fix, I don't think in this current environment on data, it is going to be easy at all. I think it would be quite difficult.
Well, we have reached the end of our panel, and there's so much more to talk about here, and I greatly appreciate all the panelists. As I started with this conversation, this has been a long time conversation that's happened in conference after conference after conference, but you can see here we're still working, unpacking some very important issues fundamental to the functioning of the market, fundamental to global pools of liquidity. So I want to thank our panelists. Please join me in thanking them very much.